So I ended up making, I think, like 5 feet worth of handmade flashcards. Anytime any term came up that was my deal, I wrote it on a flashcard, and I constantly was going through those.
Probably heard that right. So basically, Matthew built a small person.
And then I sat down and played Baldur's Gate 3 on my computer for 2 hours. And then I went to the test. It was not going to do me any good to like try to cram anything else in my brain, because I felt like if I shoved anything else in, something else was going to fall out. And I was the way things were is the way things were going to be. First off, the score said 512. I opened it up because I saw a 2 and just assumed, but just took me a second. I saw a 520 and I was frankly pretty speechless. I did not think that I was good enough to do this well. I hope that you at least give yourself more of the benefit of the doubt than I gave myself, and trust yourself to do well in this test. If you set yourself up to succeed, you can do well. But if you don't do well, it's not the end of the world. This is not the metric of who you are. It's the metric of what you can become.
Hey, future doctor. Quick reminder before we dive in. Did you know we've got a full library of free MCAT resources waiting for you? We're talking cheat sheets, checklists, practice passages, free courses, and more, all made by real top scorers. Head to medlifemastery.com/MCAT/free and grab what you need.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan McCarthy, and I am going to be the host for today's conversation. I'm an MCAT tutor and mentor for MedLife Mastery. I was also a previous top scorer interviewee, and I am super excited to be chatting with Matthew Tucker today. Our goal in these conversations is to connect with top MCAT scorers, dive into their journeys, unpack strategies that help them reach their goals, and we try to hopefully inspire you in what can be really boring MCAT prep. Everyone hits roadblocks when studying, even people that crush the exam like Matthew. And so we're trying to break down how top scorers get awesome scores and also how they adapt to setbacks. So today we're speaking with someone who did exactly that. And I'm excited to introduce Matthew Tucker. Matthew, thank you so much for joining tonight. About 3 months out from his test day, Matthew found himself scoring in the 490s on a third-party practice test. We asked him to give us a number, and he said he had about 80% of his content locked down, but he wasn't seeing tons of that translating into his MCAT score, and he was at about a 120 on the Biochem section. He realized that knowing content wasn't enough. Wish I learned that sooner in my journey. So he needed to learn how to use knowledge effectively under test conditions while he still had a couple months of studying left. So he took a hard look at what wasn't working, and like most top scorers do, he made a strategic shift, which hopefully we're going to learn a lot about in this episode. So fast forward to test day, and Matthew got a wonderful 520 on his test, which is amazing. We're test score twins because I also got a 520. And he went from a 120 to a 132 on Biochem. So that's pretty rad. He's an excellent example of how far you can progress when you start studying strategically. In just 90 days, he increased his score over 20 points, which is awesome. So we're going to get started and get into it. Matthew, before we start on the MCAT side, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself so they can get to know you better?
Thank you for having me. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I got my undergraduate and graduate degree in bioengineering from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2022 and 2023, respectively. And since then, I traveled for a little bit because I had a feeling I wanted a little bit of time before potentially embarking on this huge studying crusade and 4 years of med school. And that kind of steamrolled into working in another lab job. I worked in a lab studying aging pathology for all of my undergrad and grad school. And then I went and did neuroscience, which I still do right now, about year 2 in neuroscience. Still at the University of Washington, just in another lab. Yeah, I super love living in Washington. I'm currently applying for medical schools right now, and there's a wonderful selection of those that are here and in Oregon and California. So really hoping to stay on the West Coast. Right now, a lot of my extracurriculars have all kind of winded down since I'm so almost 3 years now that I've been out of college. So a lot of my time is spent. I still volunteer at the local food bank that I started volunteering at. And until recently, all of my spare time was doing the MCAT. So I'm one of the many people now that are just trying to figure out what to do with all that extra time.
It's nice to have extra time, isn't it? It's weird once you finish your test, at least for me, it was of like, what is my life now outside of this? So that's super cool. I worked at a memory center for like several years on like aging research stuff. So I'm an East Coaster, so that's not similar, but maybe some aging stuff is. What's your why in terms of wanting to become a doctor? What's kind of the inspiration behind that?
Yeah, so I got involved with bioengineering with hopes of doing some early detection microfluidic devices was my original interest. And that really involved me starting to actually get involved with some shadowing purposes in rural settings because it's important to see how technology is implemented, not just in cities. And that kind of led me down a rabbit hole of where the support in our healthcare network actually needs to be. I kind of determined for me personally, I valued more of my time outside of a lab or engineering software and with people. And I believe that there was a better career path for me to get involved in being a rural physician than it was going to be for me to be a bioengineer. Was weighing some options there back and forth, which kind of sparked my interest in primary care.
That's awesome. And also, we need more primary care doctors. So I'm sure many med schools are going to be really excited to see that in your application. If you could describe the MCAT in one word, I know this is tough because there's probably a million things you could think of. What would it be and why?
I mean, I want to say frustrating, probably, which maybe I'll relate to, but I would probably say surprising because for me, a lot of the studying of the MCAT, I really fell in love again with organic chemistry and how everything in the body can be broken down just into, processes on the organ axes, into reactions, into leaving groups, into, different electron movements. You can all boil down everything down to really simple terms. And I found that was super interesting. And it's something that I totally, I took all my classes that are MCAT relevant, forever ago at this point, like 2019, 2020. And so revisiting all that information for me reminded me of why I wanted a career in science to begin with. I found that very rewarding. Also surprising because you really think you know the material really well and you get a question about it on the test. You kind of sit there for a second and be like, man, I have no idea what this is talking about. When you review the answers, it's like, oh, shoot, it was about the pituitary gland. I don't know how I missed that. It's really being truthful with yourself about what you do and don't know, and that often is unfortunately surprising and not the good way sometimes.
Yeah, the worst is when you think you've like crushed a passage and then you're like, whoa, I got 30% accuracy.
Yeah,
But we've all been there.
yeah.
And it
Those
happens.
AAMC question banks, those are brutal.
They're really hard. Yeah, the section bangs are really hard. But okay, love that. Kind of like positive and some realistic aspects to the word, but I think that's a really unique one. Where were you in life kind of like as you were starting to prep for the MCAT and kind of before this journey started? Obviously, you've been out of school for a few years, which is cool, and you talked about that, but kind of walk us through where you were at beforehand.
Of course, it's pretty simple. I was scared of taking the MCAT. It's so daunting to see an exam be worth as much or if not more than 4 years of my life studying at school. And I knew looking at this test that it was going to take a lot of my time. And I'm someone who was very busy in college. And so I tried studying a couple times, around COVID and not COVID. And then I figured out my research was kind of demand that I take additional time and do a master's to finish my projects I was working on. And so I'm like, okay, I've got more and more time. And then the years kept rolling on until eventually, this last September, I attended my really good friend who lives in Seattle still. I attended his white coat ceremony at UW. Just super cool moment. I've known him for like 8 years now at this point, and he was also interested in medicine and was part of the reason helped me decide medicine's what I wanted to do. He got into UW, which was wonderful. And I went to his white coat ceremony and I was like, dang, I can't keep putting this off. If I ever want to be at this point in my life, I have to buckle down and start studying for this test. And the next day I pulled all the Kaplan books out of the closet and just started going.
I think you wouldn't be human if you weren't a little scared of the MCAT, but I appreciate you saying that because I think that it's like just a given that we have to take it. That sometimes it's like, well, it's hard to then say like you're scared. But I think everyone listening to this or someone on the other side who's taken it, I'm sure has felt the exact same thing. I felt very scared the whole time, honestly. But yeah, okay, that's really cool. I'm glad that that ceremony kind of like reminded you of the why you mentioned earlier. What was your goal score when you were kind of starting, and how did you come up with it?
Yeah, I wanted, I'm sure like everyone else wants, above a 510. All the medical schools that aren't, Harvard or Yale or Columbia, et cetera, all these East Coast schools for the most part that require 520 as their average entrance. I looked around for a while and saw that around 512, 511 was the average entry score for all of these cohorts of future doctors. And so I knew that I wanted my MCAT to speak more highly than my grades did. I'm not ashamed of my grades, but I know that if I wanted to be distinguished, I needed something that wasn't just average for entry. I need something a little bit above. So I really wanted to get a 512. So that was something I kind of clung on to. And believe me, the day the MCAT scores came out, I was just hoping for like a 505 at that point. You really just start making bargains with whatever's possible just to scrape by with the sense of the impending score coming out.
I know. I felt the same, so I get it. But obviously, like you did great. So that's awesome. How did you plan your MCAT study schedule? I think that's a really daunting part of the process because there's so much to go over. How did you go about planning it?
Yeah, I had the Kaplan books and I had the Princeton Review, I think, large yellow book. It's like 1,000+ pages that I inherited both of those from various people in my life that either burnt out or, like my good friend, went to medical school. And I knew that was a good base content wise to start from. So I knew I was gonna have to read all of it. So I brought out this big old calendar I got from Target and I started delegating chapters of this giant Kaplan, collection of books, spreading them out, kind of trying to even out, based on how big the chapters looked in the table of contents and kind of evening out based off of, how much I remembered from each book. So I knew I was going to need to spend more time doing physics. I, even as an engineer, kind of hate physics, but less time doing biology, I thought at the beginning. So I tried to my best to balance out from what I kind of thought was going to work. One of the best tips I got when I started studying about study plans, it's really important if about a month in to revisit it a second time and adjust how things are working. I did that. I realized if I was going to really get a good saturation of knowledge, Kaplan was not going to be enough, but Princeton wasn't going to work the same way because it was just the same thing as reading texts. So I started implementing Khan Academy videos. That was probably around October, November, when I was kind of about halfway to three-quarters through some different books. I remember sitting like Veterans Day weekend, like cat sitting for my brother and reading about noble gases and ideal gas law in two different books at the same time and trying to be like, this is going to be a pain. So I really wanted to implement different ways besides reading. So I ended up making, I think, like 5 feet worth of handmade flashcards. Anytime any term came up, that was my deal. I wrote it on a flashcard and I constantly was going through those at any free time I had. And that kind of allowed me a little more flexibility with my study schedule to, if I was missing certain terms, I'd plan to put review for certain chunks of content. It's kind of like my wellness counter for content.
So for listeners, you've probably heard that right. He said 5 feet of flashcards. So basically, Matthew built a small person in his content review. That's awesome. I love like handwritten flashcards as well. And I also totally agree with you that pivoting and being willing to pivot in your study journey is so important. And at least for me, because I had to retake it, I was kind of scared to do that because you kind of get stuck in like a routine and it's a little scary to switch something and not know, like, is it gonna work? Is it not gonna work? But I think that like a pattern amongst really successful MCAT people or that they're willing to kind of mix things up and like check in with themselves on a regular basis. So I agree with you that that works really well. What were your challenges while studying? And this could be, content stuff. This could be schedule stuff. This could be like the mental headspace side. So that could be like anything you want to say. And then how did you overcome them or address them in your study journey?
Yeah, I'm sure like everyone else, the biggest challenge is just acknowledging the scope of what you have to know. Everyone always says, you have to learn an ocean, like a mile wide, an inch deep kind of content review. But then it gets more complicated with certain topics, gets more and more involved. And I found balancing how much I actually had to know to be very difficult, particularly when I was kind of determining when was the right time to make the switch from the 80% content, 20% testing to 80% questions, 20% content. And that was kind of a dilemma I struggled with having the December and the January period. Definitely lots of things that I wanted to do with my time that I couldn't do. I pretty much stopped playing any sort of game on my computer. I didn't stop going to social events all entirely. If it wasn't of a certain importance, I didn't go out and do it. I ran out of prescriptions for my contacts at one point and I get to reorder
No.
those. That was a bit of a missight on my part. But I think balancing how much I had to know with working a full-time job and still wanting to do other things really came down to about a month in me realizing it was okay to take a day off once in a while. And if I did take a day off, it really did have to be a day off where I was not thinking about the test, because otherwise it didn't do me any good. I'm sure you experienced something similar where on the days off, you just feel stressed about what you're not doing and feel like you should be using that time. But it boils down to you can't, continue to run the engine that is your brain if you're out of gas.
Yeah, I also worked full time while studying, and so it was really hard to figure out a schedule, like balancing both of those things. But then also, if I wasn't studying, I'd feel guilty almost of like I should be studying and whatever. But my cousin runs marathons, and she said, like, I could run like 2 marathons in the time you do an MCAT. I was First of all, like, whoa, because I can't run a single marathon. But also, like, it's so true that it's like a very arduous task for your brain. And so, yeah, I needed time off where I wasn't thinking about it. And for me, literally just getting out of the space I was studying in is what I had to do. Because, like, otherwise, it was really easy to kind of just like associate my house with like, it was hard for me to like watch a show, for example. But like going to the gym and like getting out of the house was like a much easier way for me to be like separating the MCAT and everything with it.
Life. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was super fortunate that I had a friend who was pretty diligent about getting me to go out to the gym every day. And I'm incredibly fortunate to have a job working in a lab where my hours can be flexible. I work right now and started working before the MCAT. I get to work like 6 o'clock in the morning and I leave by 2. That way, if I get home like 2:33, I still have a good potentially 3 to 4 hours of time that I could be studying with, which is some days is enough, some days is not, depending on what you're doing. But it kind of allowed me to have a hard cutoff where I would stop thinking about the MCAT, after dinner. It gave me enough a chunk of time where I didn't feel like I was going to be interrupting anything or be interrupted by other obligations.
Yeah, that's such a nice schedule. It's nice that your lab is accommodating or like flexible enough in that way to do that. That's awesome. Any other challenges or things that you wanted to talk about, or are we cool to move on?
I think one last challenge I had, which is kind of self-inflicted, is I got the time zone difference mixed up on MCAT sign-up day. And so logged on an hour too late. And I
Mm,
was originally supposed to take the test in January, was my goal, January 27th, I think. And that simply was not going to happen in Washington. There's only 3 testing places to take it.
yeah.
And they were booked out until March. So I ended up signing up for April 4th, which was my test date, and essentially realizing that 6 months is much more time. Great. However, if I don't do well, I'm not making it in time for this application cycle, which was kind of a little bit of a relief, but also a little bit more pressure. I wish that I had been fortunate enough to either start studying earlier, or I don't wish I had less time. I'm really happy that I had the 6 months. I do recommend that for people that have full-time jobs or feel like they can't dedicate more than 3 hours a day to studying. Unless you're, really getting everything out of it in 3 hours, it wasn't working for me to do that short of a time span. I'm really glad I had 3 months to be going over question banks and practice exams. I wouldn't have had that if I'd done it based on my original time schedule. So
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Although it kind of sucks about the time difference, but it all works out in the end, obviously. But I get that's like a lot of pressure. And yeah, people listening, mark your clocks for the right time. So, little pivot then. You've talked about Kaplan and like Princeton and everything, but people listening are going to want to know like exactly what you used to like recreate it. And the
mhm.
PSA is that we're all different learners, people, so we could do the exact same thing Matthew did and not do as well or do better. Who knows? What materials and resources, like exactly, did you use throughout your prep? And then, like, with a candid side to it, which ones were worth it and which ones do you think weren't so worth it?
I got the like 2010 issue of Kaplan books. I don't know if those are like even the most current. I had a friend who tried to do the MCAT like 5 years ago and crashed out pretty quickly in terms of his plans. And so he had always had a set that I was fortunate enough that he gave/loaned me, that in the course of my procrastination, I loaned out to several people and it got back. And so it's like 8 set of people have used these books at this point. And that's definitely where the core of my content base came from. I definitely looked at the Princeton book for like 2 subjects. I didn't really love the way that they phrased a lot of their end of topic summaries. Really like that Kaplan had questions and had ways for me to really assess what I was knowing. I already mentioned the flashcards. I have so many flashcards. It's ridiculous. And I color coded them based on every day, every other day, and once a week. And that kind of helped me cycle through cards really quickly on new content. I started with the amino acids and with the cranial nerves and kind of went from there. That was kind of the biggest use of my time that wasn't in a book. I did use Khan Academy, particularly for physics problems, because I found their videos to be very thorough. And that's something I actually got from attending the Monday like office hours for MedLife MedLife actually, is the tutors there that donate their time on the Mondays that office hours are at really do use a variety of different sources for their own problem sourcing. And so a couple of sessions in a row, they used Khan Academy physics problems. I really found that to be the best indicator of testing, friction coefficients and the type of math I was going to have to do in my head in particular. I did buy three or four things off Amazon. I bought the Kaplan note study cards, the flashcards, never used them. Got the whole 1,000 set of them, made my own instead, didn't touch them. I was planning to use them at the very end as like a keep things fresh in my brain. Never worked out that way. They are still shrink wrapped in my room. That's just how it goes. I bought the third-party book of tests from MCAT Prep. They were a bit hit and miss. I think there was a little bit of score deflation from them on my scores. Probably not a lot, considering I was missing like 15 questions per section. But I don't regret buying it because I think it was really good for me to sit down and actually have a frank conversation with myself about what I was doing well or not. Whether or not it's actually worth your time if you're looking to get tests done. It was 7 tests for $20. Pretty great. However, the no content's ever going to touch AAMC in terms of they make the test. You should always get their content if it's feasibly financially affordable for you. I also got a mnemonics book and a book of practice problems from Amazon, and I found them both to be very helpful. But I also am very much an audio learner, and so having mnemonics, my girlfriend would quiz me in the car on mnemonics. We were driving places, and that was really helpful for me to remember things, and did save me a couple times during the test in bio in particular. Practice problems were great. It was a great way to remember things I didn't know. And then lastly, of course, I did do the MCAT Mastery 6-week program starting in late January. And then I think in late February, I bought the AAMC complete bundle when it was on sale. So all of their full length tests, all of their section banks. It was like almost half off or something. It was really on sale. And so I'm like, I need it. I need it now. So I got it. I know it's a long list of lots of stuff I used. And like Megan was saying, not everything is going to work for what you want to do. I found the fastest, I suppose, solution to determining what worked for me was to try a lot and just stick with what worked. Because I was working, had enough money that I could make those choices. But if I didn't, I probably would have just stuck with the class, my original Kaplan books, and the AMC material. That would have been the best use of my money.
Yeah, AMC stuff is like holy grail for MCAT. Okay, awesome. I agree with writing your own flashcards. I always have to make my own just because like my brain thinks a certain way and like words and the way they're formatted. So I get it. How did you hear about MedLife Mastery and what was kind of like motivating factors for you in joining the live course?
Yeah, I did a pretty extensive Google search about course options. And it was, of course, Kaplan has their own. I think Princeton has their own. Those cost like $4,000 or something if you want to have, especially if you want one last minute that is very tightly paced, would require more hours per day in like a virtual class or in-person class than I could commit as a full-time employee. I also didn't really have like $4,000, which is probably hyperbolic, to spend on that kind of course, even if it did have a 15 guarantee. And I was reading a blog from an MS3 student who was talking about different content options. They mentioned MedLife Mastery because it was a lot more of an affordable option. And I won't lie, the price was a big selling point for me. What sealed the deal is that they had a class that was going to start in less than a week. It was 6 weeks, and the tutor that was leading it had a great score and had good reviews. It seemed like everyone liked what she had to say. It seemed like the program was not sketchy. It didn't seem like anything. It seemed like money I was spending was going to be worth it because the class seemed like it had a lot to offer because it really stressed a strategy portion of taking the test, which is something I really felt like I was lacking.
Yeah, all great factors in making that choice. Talk to me about your experience with it, and you can be honest in what was good and what was bad. But what do you think helped the most from the course in kind of changing your study journey up a little bit?
Yeah, my biggest PSA is if you are going to take a study course, you have to be willing to engage in it. I'm a little frustrated that a lot of people in my particular class didn't really seem like they were there to actually learn something. A lot of people did like engage, and a lot of the basis of the class is presentations from students about topics. We share our strengths, what we know content-wise, and presentations from our tutor who's running the class, and then working over passages to learn passage strategy. And that involves a lot of participation of reading passages out loud, which is, something we may not have done since, high school maybe, but it still revolves around active participation and sharing your thoughts about what it was. And they're like half people in my class just didn't seem to be willing to do that. It's like they were busy doing something else. And maybe that's just how people function in a classroom environment. Maybe people focus better when they split their attention. I would argue no, at least for myself. And so I really hope that if you do a course like this, you really do give it what you think you're gonna get out of it, because you're going to take this and you're expecting it to do all the work for you. It's not what's going to happen. However, I really enjoyed our dissections of passages and how to get the most from it. I routinely take our practice tests, had about 10 to 30 minutes or more left on every section. And that meant to me that I was going too quickly over questions and I had more time to spend really pulling stuff out. And that was something that was really stressed in the course that I really enjoyed. Lots of other people taking the course that we would go to office hours or we'd meet on our own, that we met each other in office hours and we would have our own additional time talking about stuff. And they all had insights to share from their own journeys, which I found really helpful, particularly because, not everyone's expert on everything. And I never took a psychology class, and psych was a low point for my scoring for a long time as well. So having that kind of balance the class offers of essentially creating an environment that you can create your own study plan based off the tools they give you was very useful. And I also appreciated that we could do assignments that were feedback was given. We would model how to break down a passage in our, quote unquote homework, and that would get feedback, and they'd be honest feedback. If you're crappy at it, they tell you. So I found that to be pretty helpful as well.
Yeah, I was a student in the COVID era where we had like Zoom classes when the world kind of shut down, and like
Yeah.
kind of similar. You're not going to learn anything just like sitting on your screen and doing nothing. So that like totally makes sense. But I'm glad to hear that it sounds like you kind of had like a community forum with your group and the other tutors and like mentors. And that's awesome. Obviously, it paid off because you got a perfect score on biochem, which was my hardest section, like consistently. Although I didn't end up scoring the worst on it. I scored worse on chem phys, probably because I spent more time on biochem because it was my worst. But talk to me about like how you studied for biochem specifically, and like what advice you would have for students who maybe are struggling with that section.
Yeah, I kind of delineate the difference between chem and bio based on the use of formulas mostly. I know it's not a perfect way to distinguish what content's more likely to appear in which section. Studying for bio really hit its stride about a month before my test, or a month and a half. I started going to the library after work for about 4 to 8 hours, depending upon what time the library would close, and they kicked me out. And I started using AMC content, my notes. I started taking crib notes on things. I really started to compile my own little encyclopedia of everything I thought was important for bio. My big sticking point was metabolism processes. When is it more likely for gluconeogenesis to happen, and what would happen if this one part of it is altered, or what's a patient presenting with this more likely to have? Because I felt like that was going to be the most likely point where I could make up points that I wasn't going to see anywhere else, because of how frequently it was appearing in all the practice tests I was seeing. I think it was well worth my time sitting down to really master a concept, because really modeled what I did with the rest of my bio content. Organ axes, hormones. There was stuff that I just couldn't get by with memorizing, that I needed to see and write down scenarios of what that was. And that involved me, trolling an MCAT Reddit, looking for sheets on things, looking at notes that my good friend took for his MCAT prep, looking at online at Khan Academy, whatever had any sort of scrap of knowledge. I went to try to find the specific answers to the gaps of knowledge I didn't have.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And our listeners are probably happy to hear that Reddit helped you with something instead of just Reddit's so funny to me because sometimes it's comforting and other times I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to get off. So glad you could use it for something helpful. Walk me through same thing for psych. So you mentioned you didn't take any psych classes. You got a 131, which is awesome. How did you tackle that section specifically? And any, like, same thing, any advice you'd have for students with that one?
The context probably I should be giving for these sections is I am very good at cars. I've always been very good at the cars style problems, even for just how my brain works. Is I'm very good at that kind of problem setup. However, that doesn't translate well, and I have to bring in my own information, like for all other passages. So I was able to really kind of cheat in a way where I didn't have to spend pretty much any time practicing cars beyond the strategies I learned in the MedLife Mastery course. I was pretty much routinely hitting 130, 131 on the AMC practice tests. So that really freed up some time to really memorize so much site content. I had a trip that I took in late February, early March to Guatemala because I thought I was going to be done with the MCAT by then and already bought tickets. So I didn't want to study the whole time. I didn't want to bring a bunch of books. So I took a ton of photos of my books on my phone, and I downloaded a podcast from this guy called it MedLife Coach or Med Student Coach or something. It's a blue logo with a stethoscope. It was the only podcast I could find on Spotify that I could download on my phone. And he had just started when I found him. By the time I landed in Guatemala, he had 18 episodes. I really focused on the psych ones. And it was constantly listening during all of our long travel times. Really sitting down and listening to all these different types of experiments, and then repeating the same thing I did for bio, where I really aggressively sought out answers that I didn't know, particularly for types of experiments that were on the test, different types of case control versus experimental variables. I really struggled with moderating versus mediating variable types, stuff like that. It was more about the experimental design, but stuff I really struggled with in particular. I guess my ultimate advice with that section is it's probably one that used to be a lot more memory based, and now it's closer to how the others are set up, at least from how I understand the progression through all the free tests. So I really recommend, if you don't have a background in psych, flashcard it. And then once you have the flashcard knowledge base, then isolate what you don't know and move from there. Everything can be done systematically if you have the time. I did find myself having a lot of extra time during all those sections. And so learning not to panic, thinking I missed things, second guessing my answers was also a big step I had to take, particularly for that section. I can't even tell you how many times I sat staring at this one question with two answers crossed out, tapping my fingers against my head, staring at the screen before selecting something.
I know. I always had a lot. No, I was the opposite because I was a psych major in college. So I had a bunch of extra time, and that also kind of freaked me out. But I agree with you in terms of content review being just so important. And what really helped me was just using my extra time to my advantage of reviewing things, but not second guessing. I would review to make sure I wasn't missing, but as long as I wasn't missing, I'd move on. So totally agree. You mentioned you're good at cars. It sounds like we're kind of similar test takers because cars was my favorite MCAT section. I think my first practice, I scored a 130, and I was now, let me say to listeners, this is not a common occurrence. This is a very chance thing because pretty much everyone hates cars. However, for you, do you have any advice for cars specifically? And it's fine if you don't as much and you're just naturally good at it.
I mean, it's not my favorite section. I got 124 on my first cars practice test. To me, seemed really similar to the type of problems they'd have on the ACT and SAT, where they really were just trying to get you to be guided to an answer. And so I found that myself and many other students were really good at crossing off one or maybe two answers just from quick cursory glance of the text, and really increasing my yield to move from that 124 starting base to a regular 130, 131 on that section came down to learning how to highlight well. This is the only section I really did aggressively highlight besides of formulas or values that I would see in the chem phys section. I probably over highlight what most people would consider to be normal levels for the cars section, but I found that anytime any word was used that seemed descriptive or trying to invoke an emotion, I would highlight it. And it was really helpful to try to narrow things down from there. I also found sometimes I kind of had to turn my brain off. Everyone who's doing the MCAT probably, I'm going to generalize, has read a lot of books. If you've applied for the MCAT, it means you are in the process of completing college or have completed some sort of program, and that means you've taken English as a requirement for that and took it in high school. So I know that that there's a lot of books you had to read. I read those same books, and because of that, you have lots of opinions on writing. And sometimes you really feel, looking at one of these, that there's two answers and one could be probably true. This one could also be true under this set of circumstances. They're not looking for the set of circumstances, looking for the probably true. You're going to psych yourself out from the right answer, trying to contort your way of thinking to fit that answer. Instead, you should really just be looking at what the text is saying, what the answers have, and move from there. And if that's the best advice I can give for cars. Some people who may struggle for time should probably really put all your eggs in 10 of the 11 passages, so to speak. But if you don't struggle for time, then really do take a second to breathe. Cars can induce a lot of panic. It's a Picasso passage from AMC that's very particular that everyone always talks about, because you'll be lucky to get half, because when you talk about art can really throw people off. It's not as cut and dry as other passages can be. So I recommend that you really take a second, play to your strengths, and go from there.
I think that is very solid advice. And yes, that Picasso passage is infamous, I think, in the MCAT student community. Talk me then through chem phys, which I think was your lowest, but still a great score. But talk me through kind of like your experience with that section and any advice you'd have reflecting back on it.
This section was definitely the tightest I ever had on time practicing for the MCAT. I would regularly have like 8 to 12 minutes left. For me, is enough time to go back and check all my answers, particularly if there's some I was unsure of, or used a lot of math, or I've used, multiple formulas or any converting between formulas. So I really wanted to make sure I had time to handle all of that. Unfortunately, I'm very happy with the 520. I'm not as pleased with a 127 on this section because it's like the lowest I got in this section from any AMC material. I regularly was at least 129 on chem. And what ended up happening is I ran out of time checking my answers on the test. And there's a couple of them that had a lot of equation work to do. And I just simply had to prioritize the ones where I knew if I spent an extra second, I would get it versus ones that required more time. And I definitely put an answer down for everything. But I had, I think, like 6 minutes to check, 59 answers. Some of those required checking, but I think I had like 25 flagged I wanted to go back to and look at just to double check my math. And I simply did not have time to do that. I really do attribute that to the lower score I got on there. In terms of studying for cars, for chem phys and for spending your time, it's such a broad category. Things that can happen here. You could have a light equation, or you could have an equation that deals with kinetics for a reaction. It's such a broad spectrum that studying for all the same way is not going to work unless you have found this exceptional, perfect way of studying for yourself. And then I say, bully for you, go nuts. But I found looking at different examples to be more fruitful. I think it's a very common thread that I've probably talked about, probably almost talked to death already at this point, is that the wider you go in access for the content you look at, for both questions, content itself, ways to shortcut your way through problems, the more equipped your toolkit's going to be when test day rolls around. Feeling very bad about that chem section really did rattle me. That's the only break I took that was pretty close to the actual full break length. I really did walk out of test day feeling pretty bad, particularly because I really felt that section was really, really had me by the throat there. So if you want to prevent that kind of hysteria on test day, I really do recommend making sure that you are very comfortable with all the different ways equations can fit together. The voltage equations of, voltage, force, it's like a electric field, force, potential energy can all be interconverted to each other really easily. And it's like the secret way to get like 5 questions right on the test every time, guaranteed. It's so useful, and stuff like that for other things really helpful. But I think it really did probably shortchange myself studying for this section. And if I'd spent more time, I probably would have had a little more toolkit options to use on the test that would have given me more time so I could have checked more answers.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think for a lot of students, Chem Phys is the section with the most variable amount of extra time because it is so dependent on what they've tested you on and what equations you're comfortable with versus not. So I had the same variability like when practicing. It was always the tightest and then also the most variable in how much time I had. So I get it. But you still did well. Just it's relative to kind of like you doing exceptionally well in the other ones. We can pivot to maybe something more fun to talk about, or maybe less fun, depending on a reliving test day for you. But walk us through your actual day of the MCAT. So the day has arrived. How did you feel the morning you woke up? And if you had anxiety, how did you deal with that?
If you don't mind, we'll back up probably 24 hours. I, like many people, took the day before the MCAT off, didn't do anything, didn't study. I recommend you do it. I cooked a very nice dinner for myself and my girlfriend and kind of just relaxed. Went to bed. I'm really surprised I didn't struggle to sleep that badly. I went to bed really early. I already go to bed at like 9:30 because I get up at like 4. I'm a little bit of a vampire in that manner. I went to bed fairly early and woke up like 5, 6. And I was lucky enough to live like a quarter mile from the testing location. So I knew I wasn't gonna need much time to get there. Of course, I still left with like a half an hour extra time because we all have that test day anxiety in the morning. I cooked myself eggs, had a soup with peanut butter, and then I sat down and played Baldur's Gate 3 on my computer for 2 hours. And then I went to the test. I think that was, for me, that was like the one way I knew I wasn't gonna be looking at materials. I even left my big spiral notebook with all my notes in my car, like in the secret little like tire iron compartment in my trunk. So I knew that I was not gonna look at it the test morning. It was not gonna do me any good to like try to cram anything else in my brain because I felt like if I shoved anything else in, something else was gonna fall out. And the way things were is the way things were gonna be. So I found something to distract myself with, give myself plenty of time. I already packed myself a lunch. I am not a person person who drinks coffee or takes caffeine, but for the month before test, I like really religiously drank caffeine ice, like a sparkling ice, like drink derivative. It's like 70 milligrams of caffeine in it. But for someone who doesn't take caffeine at all, it was like the clearest cut of adrenaline I've ever had. So I had like four of those a day for the month before the test, and I had one in the morning of the test, and I had them with the lunch of test because I really wanted to keep myself focused during the test itself. I took breaks. You should take breaks. I went out, ate a sandwich during my lunch, ate an apple, drank an ice, looked at the clock, chatted with the test examiner that was there about what other tests were being tested on that day. A little bit of an internal cry, and then went back in and kept going.
The only way out is through on test day. So yeah, that totally it adds up. And kudos to you for not being a huge coffee drinker. I wish I could say the same. If someone studying for the MCAT feels burnt out, frustrated, overwhelmed, kind of all of those negative emotions that can snowball, what would you say to them?
If this is what you want to do, and this is the only thing stopping you, you will find a way to get it done. The commencement speaker for the white coat ceremony I went to used the max amount of MCAT tries. They took 7 MCAT tests. It took them 5 years to get into med school, and they are the top of their class of the MS4s that are graduating. She gave a speech over the white coat ceremony. She was the presiding person. She had the longest journey I've ever heard of to getting to where things are, and she made it. And that for me was very inspiring. I really hoped it wouldn't take me 7 tries. I was lucky enough that it's just going to take me 1, ideally. There's lots of people online that will go to the MCAT Reddit. We all do it. We all see the 524. We all see the 520. We all see the 480s on test day. And we're like, oh man, that's going to be me. I'm going to do really poorly. And I think it's okay to have those doubts after the test is done because you already did it. But before the test, be confident in yourself. You studied for a long time. And if you really are seeing good results on your full length tests, then you will do well on the actual test unless something crazy happens. And then something crazy happens. You can take it again. It's not the end of the world. I know it's very rich of me to say. I took it once and was very happy with my score, but I didn't get a 520 in my practice tests. I got one 519 like a month before my test. Before that, it was like I got 515, a 516, and like 2 511s. And I really felt like that 516 that I got was because I really, really knew the chem and biochem content that was on both the main sections for science. I really felt that I only did well because I got lucky on content. And I was afraid it wasn't going to happen. And when test day came around, I did not know the content was not in my favor. And I still did well. So if you set yourself up to succeed, you can do well. But if you don't do well, it's not the end of the world. This is not the metric of who you are. It's a metric of what you can become.
Very well said. And I can attest as a 3-time MCAT test taker, it is not the end of the world if you have to retake it, not once, but twice or 3 times or however many times. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I want to be cognizant of time. So I have 2 more questions and then I will be done. First is, okay, you've taken the test. Great. How are you feeling waiting? And then how did getting your score back feel?
I was an absolute mess. I had a work conference like the weekend before my scores came out in May, and so I was fairly distracted. I also, until that week, was a little confused on the day my scores actually came out. I thought it was that Sunday. Turns out it was that Tuesday. So I took that Tuesday off. I didn't check anything till 2. I was an absolute mess most of the day. To the point of like I was physically like trembling for a lot of the time. Part of that's probably adrenaline from waiting. Part of it is the anxiety and always the what ifs of if I didn't do enough, I feel really bad taking it. But everyone tells me, that's just how you feel. If I am the one people that get, the bottom barrel for 76 on this test, it is forms a bell curve. I was afraid that I was not going to be good enough. I think we all struggle with a sense of being good enough when we're trying to do something like this that's so high intensity. And I unfortunately can't give you super good advice about feeling better about it until you see that score. I first thought the score said 512 when I opened it up because I saw the 2 and just assumed, but just took me a second. I saw a 520 and I was frankly pretty speechless. I never imagined I would get this high. I like to think I'm a pretty smart person. I pursued a pretty difficult degree at a pretty good school, but I did not think that I was good enough to do this well. I hope that you at least give yourself more of the benefit of the doubt than I gave myself and trust yourself to do well on this test if you think that you can, because you will always do better than you think you're capable of.
Yeah, I love that. For listeners, you are very capable of exceeding your expectations. And I had the same experience when I opened my 520. I did not think it was going to be a 20 when I saw the 2. Okay, awesome. So last question then. This can be any answer, but what are your plans kind of long-term, short-term from now? You're applying to med school, great. Where do you see yourself in the short term? And then like 5-10 years from now, where do you want to be?
Well, based on this is late May when we were recording this. So I'm going to put in my application within the next 2 to 3 weeks, probably. And then it's just fingers crossed I get some secondaries. I'm applying to a lot of West Coast schools. So I'm really hoping to get into University of Washington because it really is, it is very heavily focused in primary care. I really love to stay close to where my friends and family are before, potentially residency or something else takes me away. I would like to say in 5 years, I am graduating from medical school. Math works out pretty well on the 5 years there, so that's pretty ideal. In 10 years, it's hard to say. I like to say that I know what I want to do, that I want to be a rural primary care physician somewhere in Washington that needs me. But I went into college thinking I was going to make chips to put in people. So who knows what's going to happen. 10 years is a long time. I just hope that I'm happy and that I feel fulfilled by what I do. And I can't really ask for more than that.
I think that's a wonderful explanation. Thank you, Matthew, for all of your time and your advice and also your honesty. It's hard to relive the MCAT journey because it is like mixed emotions, I think, for most. And then I also just think that being vulnerable, especially with a stranger, is hard to do. And hopefully for our listeners, it makes them feel less alone in what can be a really isolating process. So thank you so much for your time. I wish you so much luck in applying. You're going to do great. And yeah, thank you. I'm so appreciative of your time tonight.
Of course, it was my pleasure to come on here. I don't know what sort of contact information gets put out with this, but I'm always more than willing to listen to emails of people who need advice or want help or etc. Medicine, like everything else in life, is a team sport. So you got this.
Before we sign off, remember, the path to med school isn't always smooth. It's full of setbacks, doubts, and days that feel like you're not getting anywhere. But that's part of the process, and it's one every doctor you admire has gone through. Don't stop now. You got this. And if you're looking for someone to actually look at your prep and help you figure out what's missing, what's working, and what needs to change, you can work with one of us. We personally pair you with the most ideal top-scoring mentor for your MCAT situation. Learn more at medlifemastery.com/MCAT mentors.